you for joining us for today's web discussion on fighting online hate speech and fake news in a global crisis. Today, Mark Lemon and I will co-moderate the session together with our excellent panelists and all of you. There is a high concentration of expertise with more than 400 participants here in Zoom and on our Facebook page. In order to participate in the session, please use the text chat to make your comments, to ask questions, and those comments and questions will be transmitted into our main discussion by our colleague Natasha. The idea for Rights On emerged out of the interest to maintain the global conversation on human rights, especially at a time of crisis, when many fundamental human rights and freedoms are being challenged by emergency measures enacted in response to the virus outbreak. Alongside the Geneva Internet Platform, the initiative is organized in partnership with the Universal Rights Group, Geneva Human Rights Platform, the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, the Essex Human Rights Center, and permanent missions of Norway, Denmark, and the Kingdom of Netherlands to the United Nations in Geneva. As you can see, we have a very diverse group today, which will join us in discussion. The largest number of today's participants are from civil society, followed by the private sector. We have also a quite high attendance from research and academia, governments, international organizations, and media worldwide. Our plan is to hold the Rights On discussion every Wednesday. And without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Mark to introduce our panelists today and to kick off, I hope, lively discussion. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Jovan, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, as Jovan said. It's really exciting, and I'm really happy to be here for this first discussion under this new format. It's the first time I've done it, so I'm nervous and excited. But I'm very happy that so many of you have been able to join us, including one person I saw just sent the first message from Barbados. So I think that shows the power of the internet. So we've chosen for the first discussion to talk about hate speech and fake news, especially in this time of global health crisis. And I think that was a very important choice. Of course, incitement to religious, racial, and other hatred and violence has long been a problem in the world. In fact, going right back to the beginnings of the United Nations, and indeed even longer than that. But these challenges, these human rights challenges of hate speech and fake news have been given even greater standing and scale by the onset of the digital age. And people, of course, can use the internet for good, but individuals, including senior government representatives in some cases, can also use the internet to spread messages of hatred and division. And that can spread rapidly around the world, of course, using social media and the internet. So, for example, hate speech or hateful comments, incitement in one part of the world can quickly lead to attacks against Muslims in Christchurch, against Christians in Colombo, against Jews in Pittsburgh, and many, many other tragic examples that I could give you. This problem of hate speech online has been given a new dimension, really, by the COVID-19 crisis. Migrants, Chinese and other Asian people, Muslims, Jews, and many others have been blamed, or rather scapegoated, for this pandemic. Some world leaders, including, of course, most famously, perhaps President Trump, have been quick to blame foreigners, in his case, China and Chinese people, calling this the Chinese virus, for example. And this has real consequences. Twitter, for example, has reported a 900% increase in hate speech directed against Chinese people or people of Chinese origin. Many of the comments on Twitter using hashtags like China virus. And of course, hate speech in turn leads to a steep rise in hate crimes in many parts of the world. The current pandemic has also seen the related problem of fake news online being brought into even sharper focus. In the context of a health crisis and in a climate of fear and uncertainty, such misinformation can have devastating consequences. Whether the fake news claims that the whole thing is a hoax, that it's the result of a lab experiment in Boston or Paris, or that it can be treated using a certain pre-existing drug, or even very strong alcohol. It can also lead to a rise in hate speech and hate crimes, and even to diplomatic fights, such as the recent spat between China and the US, at a time when the international community should be working together, of course, through international cooperation. So these are the issues and questions we'll be discussing today, as Jovan said, with an incredibly rich panel of experts from around the world. And we'll be trying to understand the underlying trends, ask the important question, following question: do the member states of the UN have the tools necessary to address and to combat these problems of hate speech and fake news, especially at the moment during lockdowns related to the coronavirus? We have on the panel with us 5 speakers. First, Dr. Bahia Tahsib-Lee, who is the Human Rights Ambassador of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Secondly, Dr. Andrew Fagan, who's Director of the Human Rights Centre at the University of Essex. Third, Mona Rishmawi, who's Chief of the Rule of Law, Equality, Non-Discrimination Branch at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Simona Cruciani, who's Political Affairs Officer at the UN Office for Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. And last but not least, Paige Morrow, who's a Senior Legal Officer at Article 19, which is a freedom of expression NGO. Before we go over to our speakers, we would like to ask the opinion of all the participants, this is an interactive session after all, on one of the issues we'll talk about today. Therefore, the clever people at Diplo have prepared a survey that should appear on your screens. And the question is, what in your opinion, to all participants, is the most common or the most damaging or prevalent type of online hate speech during the current crisis? So you can now vote.
We have a clear trending on 2 lines, racial and nationality.
Yeah, that's perhaps not surprising, especially considering the different recent events and public announcements by different political leaders that I mentioned in the introduction. But I think it's still incredibly powerful that this is also the message that's going out, that there's been a spike in hate speech against people based on their nationality or race or ethnic origin. Okay, well, thank you for everybody for voting for that. I guess that poll is closed. So we will now turn to the first speaker. The way this will work is I will ask, me and Jovan will ask, or Jovan and I will ask one set of questions to the different panelists or discussants. And then please, everybody who is listening in, submit your questions and comments in writing, as Jovan said. and we'll try and select a few of those questions for a second round of questions to the experts later on in the meeting. So firstly then to Bahia from the Human Rights Ambassador of the Kingdom of Netherlands. Good afternoon to you. So as we've just seen, hate speech against individuals based on religion, belief, race, nationality has always been one of the great human rights challenges facing the international community in the United Nations, but it's even more so now during the current pandemic. Now it's clear that through this climate of fear and uncertainty, hate speech is being used more than perhaps ever before to stigmatize and blame the other. Is the Netherlands concerned about this rise in hate speech in the context of the coronavirus crisis, both in the Netherlands and internationally? And do you think governments and the United Nations have the tools to be able to respond, especially at this time of lockdown? Please, Bahia.
Thank you, Mark, and hello, everyone. It's a great honor to take part in this web chat. All our societies are currently under pressure. Thus, how we respond to this unprecedented threat is really important. The Netherlands is concerned about the global rise in hate speech directed against people on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, religion, belief, gender, and sexual orientation. We firmly support freedom of expression on and offline. With physical distancing, we increasingly connect through internet platforms. In the Freedom Online Coalition, the Netherlands works closely with other countries to safeguard a safe and secure space online. As you asked, Mark, the Dutch National Human Rights Institute reported that some people in my country experienced negative stereotyping during the corona outbreak too. But many immediately responded that such attacks are unacceptable and that we must stand together. I'm proud that the Netherlands plays an active role. The importance of building inclusive and resilient societies and pushing back against incitement to hatred was recently discussed at a conference that the Netherlands organized on combating religious intolerance. Also, the upcoming World Press Freedom Conference in The Hague provides an excellent opportunity to interact on issues such as hate speech, disinformation, misinformation, and the role of the media in times of crisis. Initiatives like the social media hashtag #IamNotAvirus are encouraging. This crisis is testing our commitment to human rights for all. This crisis is testing societies, governments, communities, and individuals. Regarding your second question, Mark, on the United Nations, we can only effectively tackle this crisis together under the able leadership of the United Nations. The human rights implications of this global health crisis are simply immense and impact the entire human rights spectrum. So economic and social rights, such as the right to health, and civil and political rights, such as freedom of speech and access to information. A strong, coherent human rights-based approach to the COVID-19 response is therefore crucial. The statements and practical guidance by the UN Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the specialized agencies, special rapporteurs, and the human rights treaty bodies all emphasize the need for full respect of human rights and that there is no place for discrimination, racism, and xenophobia. The UN General Assembly unanimously affirmed this last week. In March, the Human Rights Council sessions abruptly came to an end. As a member, we hope that the Council will function soon online. For now, the Netherlands welcomes the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights' engagement tomorrow in a virtual, informal conversation with the Council's members and observers on COVID-19 and human rights. I sincerely hope that today's web chat will increase awareness on human rights being the very oxygen of humanity, especially in this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahia. It's very interesting. I think especially what you said about the response or the solution to hate speech and fake news during this crisis requires everybody to work together and for international cooperation to really come to the fore, which of course is especially challenging at a time when we're not all able to meet each other. Diplomacy traditionally works, of course, by person-to-person contact. But I think that shows also the importance of initiatives like today's, so that we can keep the conversation going. And it also, of course, means that it's important to reassure everybody that the United Nations human rights machinery continues to turn, even at a time of crisis when everybody is confined, or a lot of people are confined to their homes. So I would like to send that message out, that the UN human rights system does continue to work even at such difficult times. Before we move to the next speaker, Simona, we would like to share some interesting data showing the scale really of the problem we're talking about. So this is the number of takedowns by Facebook of examples of hate speech around the world in millions. So it shows between 2017 and the second quarter of 2019, the huge, really huge increase in the incidence of hate speech that was so severe that Facebook took them down. And it's important to remember, just like there's behind every statistic we're hearing at the moment in terms of numbers of cases and number of deaths caused by coronavirus, it's also important to remember that behind each of these statistics in this graph, there is somebody around the world who has suffered because of hate speech directed at them, their community, or people from their country, or adherence to their religion. And this really does have a devastating impact on people's dignity and people's human rights and people's lives. So it's really a sobering message. And I suspect if we had figures for 2020, the first quarter, it would show that this has increased even further. Okay, now moving on to Simona, who is joining us from New York, which is one of the advantages of internet meetings, because we didn't need to fly her all the way to Geneva to join this discussion with us. Therefore, saving on emissions, saving on costs, and improving efficiency. So Simona, the question to you is, what role do politicians, religious leaders and community leaders have in avoiding the kind of rhetoric that might incite hatred against certain groups or individuals during this time of crisis? And on the other side, in terms of speaking out against cases of hatred, stigmatization and intolerance. Simona, please.
Thank you, Mark, and to everybody else in this panel and those who have joined this meeting from far or from close, like me, for instance. I would like to build on the intervention of the previous speaker and reiterate that the United Nations have been particularly concerned by the issue, by the challenges that hate speech poses to our shared common principles and values for a long time. And needless to say that yesterday we celebrated the Day of Remembrance for the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda, that was escalated by very serious instances of hate speech that constituted incitement to genocide. The concern of the Secretary General in particular led the United Nations to develop last year the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on hate speech. The Secretary General has spared no occasion to reiterate his concern and to highlight that this is a global challenge that affects all countries, and that nobody and no country is right now immune from hate speech, especially now that the COVID has elevated this challenge at a very high level. You must have heard also that the hate speech right now related to COVID is sparing nobody, and not even UN staff. Just last week we received some information that colleagues in some peacekeeping missions are under serious threats of attacks because of COVID-related cases in these peacekeeping missions. But I would like to now just focus on the question that you asked me, and to stress that all people with influence, be these political leaders, religious or community leaders, can play a very important role, both to incite to discrimination, hostility, and violence using hate speech and hateful messages. And we have seen this many times in the past, and even right now in the current pandemic. You have mentioned some names, Mark. I want to refer to some religious leaders who are asking people to go to their religious shrines, to their temples, to their mosques, to their churches, and so on, because by going they will be healed, they will recover if they are sick, or they will not be infected. And this is, of course, creating even more contagion, in particular because this is against the guidance of the WHO in a time where there are very clear guidances, scientific, based on scientific information on knowledge. There are still political, religious, and community leaders that are opposing this guidance and creating even more havoc. But we also know that on the positive side, we have leaders with influence on very large population groups that are playing a very good role. They are sharing messages of tolerance, they are of respect for diversity. They are asking their people to respect and abide to scientific information on knowledge. And it's on these people, on these leaders, that the United Nations is trying to capitalize right now. And the Secretary General is sparing no occasions to also call on the role of these influential personalities and ask them to contribute to the fight against the pandemic and the hate speech that is related to it. I have already mentioned the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech. That is it's an internal document that the United Nations has developed, but one of its commitments is really to work more closely with various partners, including member states, influential personalities, media, experts, and civil society to fight hate speech. But the United Nations, we have also other documents, other policy frameworks that provide really guidance on how to work better with influential leaders, including the Plan of Action for Religious Leaders and Actors to prevent incitement to violence, the UN Plan of Action to safeguard religious sites, the Faithful Rights Initiative, and I'm sure Mona can say more about this during her presentation. My special advisor on the prevention of genocide just published last week, together with the High Representative of the Alliance of Civilization, a joint call for solidarity, compassion, and unity in the COVID pandemic. We had a lot of statements that have been published by the Human Rights Mechanism, and also UNICEF has launched yesterday a global multi-faith religious in action COVID initiative. We focus on faith and positive change for children, families, and community. So there are a lot of policy frameworks and initiatives that are specific to this current challenge. And as the UN Secretary General said many times, this is the time to join hands and to enhance solidarity, because it's only through solidarity that we will be able to overcome this terrible challenge. Over.
Thank you, Simone, especially for the strong message at the end about the importance of international solidarity and everybody pulling together, and also for reminding us that we all have to play a role, and religious and community and political leaders have a particularly important role, I think, in terms of both sending out the correct messages and good messages, but also avoiding any kind of inflammatory rhetoric. We will now pass the floor over to my good friend Mona Ishmawi, who is normally with me in Geneva, but we're in different countries. I'm in France at the moment, over the border. Mona, the question for you, which isn't actually on my piece of paper, but the question, if I remember correctly, are hate speech and fake news, but also the wider consequences of the COVID-10 pandemic, affecting disproportionately certain groups and individuals based on race, religion, gender, and disability? And of course, I ask this because you're the chief of the Non-Discrimination and Equality branch at OHCHR. So please, Mona, if you could answer the question within 4 or 5 minutes would be great. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the question. I'm actually in France. I'm closer to you than you think, Mark. So, but in this time of confinement, I think the message of solidarity is really the most important message today. I think this is a time where everybody needs to work together. We saw that really the pandemic doesn't really distinguish between people on the basis of their race or gender or political leaders, or if you are rich and poor, or your social status. So for us, I think only small people can actually make these distinctions really an important part of what they do. And hate speech, frankly, has no place, in particular at this time. I have to say, though, that every time we go into crisis, the natural reaction of some people is to blame the other. And the other is often the other race, the other gender, the other nationality, the foreigner, the refugee, the migrant, the person who is the non-national. And I've been looking at the social media quite a bit, and I've seen some of the messages that are actually circulating in one country. They should be burned. In another country, prisoners should be used, which are disproportionately foreigners should be used as guinea pig for testing on this pandemic and so on. So I think, frankly, that is not helpful, and that's really going in the opposite direction of what we need to do to save ourselves from this pandemic and to control the pandemic. The only way we can control this pandemic is really through working together and through countries working together, irrespective of the nationality and so on. I am very glad, Mark, that you said that really the UN human rights system is keeping a close eye on what is going on. We are, thanks to the technology and thanks to the way we are working right now, we are able to connect with our colleagues throughout the world. And the High Commissioner is actually keeping a close eye on what is happening, not only in the context of the Human Rights Council and what is happening with member states, but also on the ground and with the field offices. So, and the special rapporteurs have been really highlighting receiving communications from individuals and groups about rights and reacting to these communications. So our system is up and running, and despite the confinement and thanks to the technology, I think we are able work in the way that we can. I think there is no doubt that certain groups are more vulnerable than others in the context of this pandemic. And I think the question of poverty and exclusion, which is often associated with people with migrants, with refugees, with indigenous people, with minorities, and so on, is affecting. We keep hearing about social distancing, how we need to have social distancing from our physical distancing. We put it like this rather than social, because we need to be together socially but distancing physically, so we need this solidarity. I think this physical distancing clearly is very difficult for certain communities, and I'm thinking particularly in terms of war, of refugees, of detainees, of people in detention, overcrowded places of detention, of indigenous people, of certain minorities, and they are the same people, so they are very vulnerable to this. Basically, they don't have the basics. They don't have, often they cannot socially, they cannot physically distance. They don't have access to clean water. They don't have access to safe water and sanitation and all this stuff. Yet they are blamed, and there is a lot of hate speech around them. So we have to be extremely careful. We have to act in solidarity with each other. And states have obligations, to be very honest, and their obligation is to protect us all and to do their best to protect us all, irrespective of our race or our nationality. This is really very important. The other issue that I want to briefly touch on, two issues that I want to briefly touch on. One is the question of access to information. Putting information on social media about things that could work or doesn't work really doesn't. Right now, we all need to hear the experts. We all need to hear the doctors. We all need to stick to the messages that we are getting from organizations like the WHO, from the United Nations, and from medical experts within their own countries. And the measures that are taken are extremely important. We don't need to spread fear in the population. People are afraid enough. We don't need to talk about medication just for the purpose of making money out of it. We don't need to talk about spread of certain drinks or whatever just to make money out of it, or to reduce the significance of what is going on. People are dying. We need to be rational about it and listen to the experts on that. So fake news is actually almost criminal in this case, because fake news could lead to killing people, and that's really, really not helpful. I know my sister is listening. I just checked; she is listening to this today. And she and I are often talking about this. Oh, did you hear? They say the onion helps. That this drink helps. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. We really just need to listen to what the medical doctors are saying. Listen to WHO. Heed the advice of the experts, and really not to try and make money out of this very bad situation, or to take advantage out of this situation. Maybe not only money, maybe also political advantage. Last point that I want to make is that none of us is just a single identity person. Most people who are working and helping in this pandemic are women. A lot of them are foreigners. A lot of them are migrant workers. A lot of them are working under extremely difficult conditions. If you look in certain countries, the people from the medical profession who actually passed away are disproportionate, actually, people of certain ethnic origins or different ethnic origins. So we have to be extremely careful. If you want people to help you when you are sick, you cannot really go out there and spread hate against them in the media. This is again a time for solidarity. We in the United Nations, I think Simona spoke a lot about how we are working in the United Nations on this. We are very agile. We are working with states. We are working helping with various guidance and policy lines, but we are also very realistic. We know that leadership matters now, leadership at the level of the state, at the level of the community, the level of society, religious leaders, and so on matters. So they have to act responsibly, and they have to act in a way that helps to contain this pandemic, so we protect each other and we protect the universe and we protect humanity, rather than contributing to something really. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mona, and thank you all previous speakers for excellent introductory intervention. Now we'll have a second survey with a relatively simple question. If you are concerned about the rise of fake news, therefore we'll make a quick bridge from the, let's say, hate speech more toward fake news. But I would like just to bring 2 points. If you can see me behind this this survey, are 2 points. There is one counterintuitive development that we should reflect on. At least in Europe, people are realizing important role of migrants, because they are very often in the profession that are now running shops, running public transport, medical services. At least I heard few comments here in Switzerland and from friends in Germany that there is a new appreciation for the role that migrants, economic migrants mainly, play in these societies. And second quick reflection for our thinking while you're taking the poll is we have to admit that we know very little about this virus. And this is the fertile ground for the conspiracy theories and for fake news. And I'm sure that Andrew will reflect on that. Therefore, it's not just intentional manipulation, but also quite a fertile ground. Even experts, sometimes in a few days, they deliver contradictory statements. That's one reality. 2 points: more appreciation for migrants as a key carrier of difficult tasks in many countries, especially in Europe. And second point, a real challenge because of uncertainty that virus has brought. Now, your answer to the question, are you worried about the rise of the fake news? Yes, I'm worried. 60% of you. Then I'm somewhat worried, 24%. And there are those who are basically arguing that they are careful with their sources and they can make clear distinction between real news, facts, and fake news. Andrew, this is excellent intro for your reflection on fake news coming from your long academic experience. Over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, everyone? Cool, thank you. So, listen, I'm delighted to have been invited to be involved in this first inaugural event of a really important webinar series, particularly on behalf of the Human Rights Centre at the University of Essex. So it's a tough one, right? The question that I was, the draft question that I was presented with is it fair to say that the fear and uncertainty caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has created a fertile ground for fake news? Well, look, the short answer to that, of course, is yes. But I would expect you for me to provide a slightly longer and more substantial answer. So crises and mass pandemics are typically accompanied by massive increases in rumor and false information, or what the WHO director called in February, infodemics. When we're frightened and anxious, we typically seek as much information as possible to make sense of what's happening and to figure out what we should do to avoid the dangers we face. As we speak, laws are being rapidly introduced and amended aimed at preventing the spread of fake news about COVID-19, even to the extent of criminalizing the distribution of dissemination of fake news in some cases. People are likely, therefore, to be sent to jail for producing or sharing false information about the pandemic in the weeks and months ahead. At the core of our human rights perspective on this is, of course, the right to free expression or speech, if you take a US perspective on this, and obviously then what limits might legitimately be imposed upon our right to express ourselves. Free expression is, as I'm sure everyone would agree, is central to any human rights respecting democracy, but it's not an absolute right. It's limited by a number of factors, many of which are outlined in paragraph 3 of Article 19 of the ICCPR, and of course other instruments of international human rights law. These include fundamentally duties and responsibilities which states and individuals hold towards protecting the rights of others under particular conditions. Given the importance of free expression to a democratic society, we must be very cautious, I think, about calls to restrict people's right to express their opinions and views. Before we go down this path, which we increasingly are being urged to do, we must carefully consider what the grounds for limiting the right might be now. Even in emergencies such as this, we have a right to be wrong about important issues. People are, to a point, entitled to express their factually inaccurate beliefs about the pandemic, but only up to a point. So for us, from a human rights community's perspective, the crucial question is, what is that point? Put simply, one can make false statements and claims about the pandemic so long as they do not cause significant harm to others. The harm principle is a core element of the legal norms underpinning the justified restriction of free expression in any democratic, human rights respecting society. I think it's reasonable to argue that the sharing of some particularly false beliefs about COVID-19 are harmful to public health generally, and may be a contributing factor in people catching the virus and perhaps even dying from it. Similarly, some of the false characterizations of COVID-19 as a Chinese virus have found existing xenophobia and intolerance in many societies. The challenge the human rights community faces, I think, and that's why it's so important that we have these opportunities to address particularly these issues now, is how can we begin to legislate for those forms of fake news which really do cause the kind of harm to others serious enough for justifying the systematic restriction of an important right. We can call for everyone to remember that the enjoyment of rights entails corresponding duties to protect the conditions for those rights in the first place. The US human rights scholar Catherine Sickink recently did just that in a blog that she posted. But this message is only likely to resonate with those who already acknowledge the importance of acting responsibly. It runs the risk of preaching to the converted, so to speak. COVID-19, I think, confronts us with a great many challenges. It also reminds us of some uncomfortable features of human reasoning. I speak as a philosopher, ultimately. We have a strong tendency, all of us, I would say, to hear what we want to hear and what we already believe. The widespread endorsement of fake news about COVID-19 by otherwise perfectly sane and capable people points to a deeper problem confronting societies everywhere, namely wholesale failures in education, which have left many people incapable of thinking critically and for themselves about some of the most important issues for us all. I know that's a controversial point to make in this kind of discussion within the context of a democracy, but we really will, I think, have to face just how gullible many people have become in our current very divided world. When we overcome this pandemic, this worldwide gullibility and lack of critical thinking will need to be systematically confronted. I think that's a slow burn, long-standing challenge that we're all going to need to confront. We should be resistant and reluctant, I think, to go down the criminalizing fake news route too quickly. I think we need to confront the complexity of this particular issue now and going forward, once we are past this pandemic, how we can begin as a human rights community to encourage a different way of educating our global population about what, after all, is the greatest challenge that any of us are probably ever going to face in our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for this excellent academic and substantive reflection. We were joking before the session that academic intervention can be abstract. And one point from the latest crisis is that most of us learn what is exponential function in mathematics and what is the flattening of the curve. And at least one collateral advantage of this crisis that we refresh our knowledge of mathematics. But what you mentioned is the lack of trust. And we'll just show quickly one survey on decline of trust, which is more than 40%. Trust of individuals worldwide who trust the media less as a result of fake news globally. And then you have a per country, the highest trust in Tunisia, Turkey, Russia, and the lowest is in Japan. This is to your point that the lack of trust in expertise and dealing with unknown, known unknowns or unknown unknown, whatever you will frame it, is creating really unique time which covers educational aspects, general knowledge, role of media, roles of politicians and experts. Mark, over to you for the last leg of our discussion and hearing from our audience, please.
Okay, thank you, Jovan. So before we go to hearing the questions from the wider participants, we have our last speaker, which is Paige from Article 19. I mean, Andrew, very interestingly, and thank you, Andrew, for the short and the long answer, though especially the long, more philosophical answer, which was really interesting. One of the points you touched on was the importance, as we seek to address the issues of hate speech, incitement and fake news, to do so in a way that respects and doesn't undermine freedom of expression, of course, which is both absolutely crucial, but also incredibly difficult. And it's a very sensitive question, of course, as well. Luckily, Paige and Article 19 are experts in this area, so she will help us clarify it. My specific question to Paige is that one of the ways in which we are seeing society as a whole address the issues of hate speech and fake news is that it can't be left to governments alone or UN mechanisms. The social media companies themselves need to start taking action. Of course, this has been a huge debate for a long time, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's other social media companies. And what we've seen over the past few months or even 6 months is a very interesting trend towards self-regulation by the social media companies. In the case of Twitter, that's focused on fake news, especially fake news that can be used for political purposes. Facebook have done a huge amount of work to strengthen self-regulation of hate speech, including setting up an oversight body recently, which includes, I think, some of Paige's former colleagues from Article 19, which has an overview function about Facebook's decisions to take down certain elements which may be or may not be fake news. So my question to Paige is, do you agree that this is a clear trend at the moment towards self-regulation? Is it something that we should welcome as a key part of the solution to hate speech and fake news, especially at this time of crisis, global health crisis? And are there also risks involved with any kind of outsourcing of responsibility for regulating and monitoring hate speech? Please, Paige.
Well, thanks so much for having us. So Article 19 as a freedom of expression organization is obviously very concerned about overbearing attempts by government regulators to bring a hard law response to this issue. And as Andrew rightly pointed out, there's no international standard or requirement under international human rights law for anyone to speak the truth and we have one of the benefits of having a free and open society is precisely our ability to share our opinions, whether or not those later prove to be incorrect. So I would distinguish crucially between misinformation, or a lot of people call it fake news, but so this idea that information that is incorrect in some way, and hate speech, and they often overlap. So a lot of the rumors we've seen about COVID-19 have had some sort of racial or ethnic discrimination present. But our response to misinformation, we would suggest, would need to be primarily through non-legislative means. And so for that, we really need to have the tech companies on board for them to be leading the initiatives themselves. For hate speech, we have clear guidance we've got on what would rise to the level of hate speech that needs to be criminalized. And we've had a number of initiatives from countries like the UK, Germany, France, that have either already passed laws or in the process of passing laws, as well as at the EU level, to address hate speech. The problem that we have is that when it's below that threshold, so when it's considered to be harmful, but it doesn't hit that legal definition, then that falls within the terms of service of social media companies. And so we end up having to go back to their internal policies anyway. And so what Facebook has done with its oversight board is try to set up an internal mechanism for providing some policies and procedures. And so we welcome self-regulatory mechanisms. What we would say as an organization is that these should ideally be independent. So what we've put forward as a proposal is a social media council that would be independent of any tech company, modeled on the old press councils. So the idea is that it's an initiative led by the industry itself to develop common approaches. And so in the context of coronavirus, we could think about there being either, you know, a discussion within the council about addressing misinformation. At what point is that threshold of taking down content appropriate? Like YouTube now has this policy to take down any information linking 5G and coronavirus. Is that the right response? Or is Facebook's policy of only taking down misinformation where it's linked to clear harm to the individual, is that a better standard? So these are the kinds of, I think, questions that can be perhaps better hashed out when there's a more standardized approach. And to also flag that I think these self-regulatory mechanisms are often put in place to get ahead of hard law. So it's when tech companies see that there is the possibility of hard regulation that they tend to take their own initiatives, which isn't necessarily a negative on its own. But that also, I think we need to be careful that the larger platforms, the dominant platforms, are better able to implement them. And so whatever hard law or legislative measures we put into place needs to recognize that our ultimate goal, I hope, is to have a plurality of platforms on which users can express their views. And in order for that to promote that, we need to recognize that it's more difficult for small platforms to conform with these types of requirements. So for example, when we've had discussions in the EU terrorism regulation to take down content in an hour, Facebook can comply with that much more easily than a small independent platform focused on you know, very niche interests. So I'll turn that back over, and happy to have some comments from and questions from the group.
Thank you, Paige. Very, very interesting, reflecting on a very interesting development, which is this move by Facebook and others, but sometimes with being prodded by the European Commission and others, but sometimes upon their own initiative to really take some of these issues around hate speech and fake news and freedom of expression far more seriously and do their part. We're now at the part of the meeting where we're going to hand over to Natasha, who will give us a selection of some of the questions that the hundreds of people online who have been watching have been sharing. And then what I'll do is I will ask each of the panelists in the same order we did before, just to very briefly comment or respond to some of those questions. Because we only have about 10-15 minutes left. Natasha, please, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. I will try to be very brief. There was a very lively discussion in the chat and we received many questions and comments, but I will try to be as brief as possible given that we are rather short on time. The more popular subject in the chat was definitely hate speech. We received a question from Karen that asked, is increasing filters on the internet to filter out hate speech manageable, or does it invade the freedom of speech? She also asked whether younger generations, being the majority of people on the internet, could possibly use education to minimize hate speech, for instance, spreading awareness in lessons. There was Mervat who asked about what is the expected knock-on effect of hate speech initiated through the internet and social media platforms, especially on those who do not have access to digital technologies and internet platforms, but receive the outcome of such information and hate. Then there was a question from Carlos Lopez from the International Commission of Jurists, He raised the point on tech companies and asked whether we would be happy to leave them the responsibility to adopt their own law definitions of hate speech and fake news, define their policies and implement them, or is there a role for the international human rights communities on this? And Jenny tied on to this, asking whether the UN and tech companies could handle the situation of political figures themselves posting misinformation and hate speech. There was also a question from Richard Hill on fake news, who asked, what could we do about the conflicting and inaccurate information coming from governments and media sources that are supposed to be reliable? That would be all from the chat for today.
Thank you. Very expertly summarized, and thank you to all those people who participated with those excellent comments and questions. I'll now go back through the panel in the same order as before. If each, I'm not even going to try to direct those questions to the relevant people. So if each of you could please pick one or two of the questions and respond or offer comments or thoughts in just 1 or 2 minutes, that would be great, and then we'll wrap up afterwards. So first, Bahia, the Human Rights Ambassador from the Netherlands. You need to turn your mic.
Sorry, everyone, I didn't realize that. So I would like to select, first of all, the question regarding young people. I find it so important that we teach them about human rights norms, and also that hate speech is not acceptable. Today, actually, at the Utrecht University, it's the university where I studied in the Netherlands, one of the professors was engaging this morning with young people, primary school children, and teaching them about human rights norms, and of course also about freedom of expression and its boundaries. So I think especially in these times, when also our schedule is a bit more flexible, this is a way that we can reach out to primary school children, high school children, and also universities, and share more, because they are also constantly online, and they also like to engage. My daughters also, they were very interested in today's discussion. So I think that is really something that we can focus on. And the other thing about fighting misinformation and disinformation, what my foreign ministry does every single day, they send out an email to all of us, whether you're based in The Hague or abroad, and they give us lines to take and explain what the views are of our government, which fully relies on the views of experts. So this is a way that we can, when we all speak in one voice and convey the same message, that is extremely powerful. So we have to counter it with correct and accurate information based on knowledge of the experts, of course.
Thank you very much for those short but very powerful remarks, especially reminding us the importance of youth in this. And just so everybody knows, we did send an invitation to this event out to the Model UN network. So if anybody from the Model UN is out there and listening, it's very good to have you with us. Next then, Simona, for concluding thoughts and responses and comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. I would also like to pick on the question on education first, and say that this is a very important issue that the UN is taking seriously. And in the context of the implementation of the UN Strategy and Plan of Action, my office, jointly with UNESCO, is planning an interministerial conference with member states that will focus on the issue of education for prevention, with a focus on combating hate speech. This conference is supposed to take place in 2020 in the second half. But let's see how the pandemic situation will be in the next months. But just to say that this conference will include a youth forum. So we'll capitalize on the presence of a large youth participation. Secondly, I would like to pick on the issue of the collaboration between the United Nations and tech companies to handle what has been called fake news. Let me say that I don't like to use this word like fake news, because it seems to me like empowering certain narratives that I don't share and I don't support. I very much prefer to use misinformation and disinformation. But in this context, I would like to highlight that we were planning to organize a roundtable with tech and social media companies at the end of April to discuss these companies' contribution to the implementation of the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech. Now, this roundtable has been put on hold, but we are considering ways of having it online in the very near future, and we will definitely keep you posted. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Simona. Mona, last final comments and thoughts and responses to some of the questions.
Yeah, I think all the questions are actually very, very interesting, and thank you for the engagement on them. I think I would just say 2 words about 2 issues. One, with regard to the tech companies, of course, the engagement has been really, or companies in general, the engagement has been really with the United Nations has been really very, very deep, I would say, on many contexts, particularly in the context of human rights. And there is a number of initiatives that are ongoing on that in that regard, with regard to organizations such as Global Pulse, which is the UN entity that take issues in the UN context, and the Secretary General has had a panel on the issue of technology and human rights, which basically touches on a number of these matters. So clearly there is a lot of work to be done on this area. And I think from that self-regulation, I like what you said actually. Is it Page who said self-regulations often comes ahead of harder. That's really an interesting perspective, and I think it's something we need to keep an eye on. I just want to also pick up on the issue of the digital divide, and I think because it's really an important question. Because even in some societies where not everyone has access to the electronic world, the virtual world, to the social media, those who have access shape what is going on in the entire population. So it's basically the elite who have access, who have the money, who have the possibilities of basically access information, and then the way they actually deal with it and they actually bring it back in the society can include a lot of prejudice. So you see some of the prejudice in the print media, and not only in the social. You see it in how governments sometimes react. You know, we have to be extremely vigilant, because with these confinement measures and the restriction measures and the extraordinary measures that are being taken, we'll have to make sure that are not abused. So human rights defenders, people, foreigners, people, minorities are not disproportionately affected by the measures that are taken, and the measures themselves are proportionate to what actually can be done. So I think with the focus on with the elite focus controlling part of what is going on, the information that is going on social media, that actually have a very dangerous impact. You see it in certain societies, communities have a very dangerous impact on what is happening on the society as a whole, and in forming opinions about identity, about certain groups, about who's good and who's bad and who's communicating and so on. Last point is that on this is the importance of scrutiny. I think everybody wants to cooperate. Everybody wants. I think we all want an end to this situation that we are in. We want an end to the pandemic, but of course, you know, looking critically at the measures that are being taken is not a crime. I mean, we all have the right to ask questions, even in a context that is a question is like that. So even posting things on the internet that is basically asking questions about what is being done, this is not a crime. So we have to be careful also that freedom of expression and is not a casualty in what is happening right now. Thank you. And thank you very much for a great event.
Thank you, Mona, for your kind words, but also your very interesting comments. Andrew, this time it can be a short response to some of the questions and any concluding thoughts.
Just to start, apologies to those people who have asked me questions directly. I'm a man, I can only multitask so far, so apologies for that. So very briefly, Mark has given me the rush along, I can sense that strongly. I think my answer is, my comments are going to hopefully encompass the kind of spirit of many of the questions that were raised. And really it concerns what happens after the pandemic, what happens when we are towards the other end, as it were, as we will do, get to the other end of this particular pandemic. I think it's, at the moment, we are utterly dependent upon reliable expertise. We ourselves as individuals have a fundamental duty to know what we ought to be doing and not be doing. And most importantly, our politicians and our political decision makers need to have access to reliable and objective scientific and epidemiological expertise and advice and what have you. But after that, when that's behind us, we're really going to be confronted by a series of very complex and very fundamental political questions, I think, and political challenges about the kind of society that we want to live in, and the kind of society that better addresses the human rights standards that we all subscribe to and seek to protect. So specifically, do we need various forms of codification for tech companies operating in these fields? Yes, absolutely. Where do we seek those kinds of codifications? Where do we seek those kinds of norms? I think that has to take place within a refashioned political context, and that's going to be a long-standing and long drawn-out challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Very, very interesting as always. And last but not least, Paige, who I see anyway has been multitasking and answering questions on the chat, so a signal to us men about how things should be done. Paige, any oral responses?
Yes, I just want to quickly reply to the point that was made about how tech companies should respond to public leaders who are increasingly relying on social media to communicate directly with the constituents, and the somewhat ad hoc approach that's been taken to either leaving them up or deplatforming them. And what we've been involved in cases actually in Italy about whether or not a far-right political party should be deplatformed from Facebook. And what we've said so far is that where there is hate speech, for example, that meets the legal threshold, then you take that content down, but you would leave up the political leader or the political party, because political speech enjoys the strongest form of protection on international human rights law, and it's completely appropriate to remove problematic content, and certainly that needs to be addressed, but that deplatforming is generally not the best way of responding to these types of problems, and it doesn't address the underlying issue of that there are people that hold these opinions, and that simply removing them from one platform often results in them moving elsewhere and doesn't necessarily address the underlying issue. So I'll leave it with that perhaps for now.
Thank you, Paige, and also to the person who is loitering over your...
Sorry, my partner is waiting back in.
Listening to make sure you don't say anything wrong or untoward. But that's it, everybody. Thank you a million times to everybody, our panelists and all the other participants who've taken part in this historic first meeting of Right On. I've really enjoyed it. In fact, I think we should only do this, do meetings like this at the UN in future. Very interactive, great comments from people all over the world. I mentioned Barbados, but I saw countries in Asia and Africa and the US all popping up, in the Americas all popping up. So thank you all. This is the first of a series of meetings every Wednesday at the same time. We'll try and do a little bit better next time on timekeeping. Each time we'll be looking at a different big international human rights issue facing the world, including the angle during the crisis of what are the implications of the coronavirus or the COVID-19 pandemic for human rights in the context of the discussion is going to be happening. So we will be sending out information on the next write-on in the next day or so. So please sign up, whether it's on Zoom or on Facebook or anywhere else. And with that, I thank you again and wish you all a good rest of the afternoon or good rest of the morning. Thank you.